Today we're going to start with chapter 18, and this is going to get us into the progressive era. We've been talking about a lot of migration and shifting to the west. We've talked about a lot of the growing problems in the urban areas. We'll look at some more of those problems today. We've talked about the Gilded Age, and the rise of big business, and some of the problems that people were having with the government not really being responsive to their needs. That starts to change as we get into the progressive era. So let's go ahead and begin looking at chapter 18, which is the start of the progressive era. We'll get more into the progressive reforms, the specific ones, in chapter 19. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. Notice the time period getting into 1917. So it is the turn of the century. This is the transition point where, when we've seen in all of these conflicts between labor and business, and the government was always siding with business, this is where that changes as well. The government is now starting to put restrictions on the businesses, which would be those progressive reforms. Let's take another look at some of the advancements, the really important parts that lead to the growth of major cities. Steel is going to be one of those main components where you've got this really, really strong metal, but it's lightweight. You know, previously the strongest metal that you would have had that would have been building structures was iron. But if you start to build a multi-story building out of iron, if you go up too many floors, the weight of the iron would collapse the building. So steel is something that is incredibly strong, like iron, but it's lightweight. So that's going to allow for these skyscrapers that we'll see, and also the suspension bridges like this one that's in New York City. This is the Brooklyn Bridge, the first of the giant suspension bridges. There's a great book, and one of those episodes of the series Modern Marvels, where they talk about how they built the Brooklyn Bridge. And it was designed, and it's over a mile long. I'll show you some pictures of it in just a second, where you start with the Brooklyn Bridge on the New York City side, and then you cross over and you're in the borough of Brooklyn. But these are steel cables here that are holding up the platform of the bridge. But these giant pillars that are sunk down in the bottom of the East River are massive. And when they were working to do that, and they're dredging out the earth, and they're trying to get these giant structures that are going to hold up the weight of the bridge deep enough into the riverbed, there was a lot that had to be learned, because you've got the pressure of the water. And, you know, if any of you are into scuba diving and you learn about diving, you've got to be very careful about the pressure, right? Pressurization. And they didn't totally understand that. So you had some of the workers here who are struggling with effects of the bends, which is when you've got that pressure underwater. So there's a lot happening here with this new technology. Look at some of these other images. I love this one from the construction, where they are starting to build those cables. And when you look at the picture on the right, I want you to really pay close attention to the modern technology of the steel, but then notice the design here. Doesn't this remind you of a stained glass window, maybe in a cathedral? So you're bringing back this old kind of almost Gothic traditional type of architecture and blending it with this more modern approach. So all of this that you see here that looks almost like a net, those are also steel cables, and it's distributing the weight of the bridge. So notice this is a pedestrian walkway across the top. That's still the same way today. The pedestrian walkway is on the top, and the cars are running on the platform underneath. At the completion of the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, many of the workers were posing for photographs. I mean, look at this. There's no safety harness there. They're hanging out on this structure, not a care in the world. And they are many, many stories above the water here on the bridge. So today, when you go to the Brooklyn Bridge and you cross over it, you've got bicycle lanes, you've got joggers, and then underneath is where the cars and the buses are going to be crossing over. But I wanted to give you a sense of the massive structure that this is. So encased inside of this container are those steel cables that are holding up the bridge, and then all of these other smaller steel cables that are distributing the weight. So this is from the Brooklyn side looking back towards New York City. And in the background, you can see the Freedom Tower that is at the old site of 9/11 before where it had been destroyed. And you can see over here to my right on the left side of the screen, there's a car passing by underneath. So there's just a ton of people around, and it's a great walk. And you actually kind of go uphill and then you come back down again. So it's not perfectly flat, it's kind of arched in the process. It's really an interesting structure. So when next time you go to New York City, I hope that you will walk across the Brooklyn Bridge, and it's a little over a mile from one end to the other. All right, with the expansion of the railroads by the 1880s, there were actually 3 different transcontinental railroad lines that will span the United States. And to understand precisely when trains were going to be leaving and arriving, and the growing number of trains that were being utilized, there had to be some sort of uniform measure of time. And we know that in Atlanta, when the sun comes up, it is in the middle of the night in California. So there has to be some sort of an understanding of time that's universal. And there was a meeting in 1883, and the major countries of the world, they got together and they mapped out the time zones. There are 24 time zones around the globe, and it separates by 1 hour. So notice here we've got Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific in the continental United States, and then you've also got the other time zones farther out in Hawaii and Alaska or whatever. But notice that Indiana and Arizona are kind of highlighted separately here. That's because those 2 states don't participate in daylight savings time, where we spring forward and we fall back during certain times of the year. Indiana and Arizona, they just flip back and forth between the time zones. So part of the year, Arizona's in Mountain Time, and part of the year they're in Pacific Time. They just don't change their clocks. So that's another interesting concept. But the necessity for time zones came about with the new modern technology. The increase in transportation required that there be a uniform standard measure of time. City transportation also is going to be revolutionized as we've got, just growing numbers, massive numbers of people living in urban areas. You've got to be able to move the people back and forth, because they can't all live within walking distance of their work because it's just too crowded by now. So streetcars and trolleys became methods for transportation in the cities. And you can see these would be electric wires up here that would conduct the trolley. And then you've got in San Francisco, the cable cars. You may have gone and ridden the cable cars before. So these are all new methods of mass transit, mass transportation in the cities. The skyscrapers, I love looking at these pictures of the construction of skyscrapers. And, this was before OSHA, the federal oversight of safety in construction sites. And so these guys are just hanging out, eating their lunch, smoking cigarettes and reading a newspaper while they're up, 50 stories in the air building these new skyscrapers. So again, the development of the Bessemer process that is now going to create the steel. And then also it makes it more practical now that we're going to have central and radiant heat that is allowing these buildings, especially up in the north, in the urban areas in the north. If you get up 10, 15 stories in the dead of winter, it's going to be way too cold for that to be any use to anyone. So now that we've got centralized heat, where you've got these big boilers in the basements of the buildings, and you would have the generators and that the radiators that the steam and the heat would come through and rise in the building and heat them, that makes it more practical. Also, the development of elevators. Otis elevators, Elisha Otis is going to be the inventor of these electrical mechanical elevators in big buildings. Nobody's going to want to walk up 50 flights of stairs to their office or their apartment, but with the elevator, that makes that again more efficient and more reasonable. If you walk into an elevator today, chances are you're going to, there are a couple of different elevator manufacturers today, but one of the biggest ones is Otis elevators, and you might see a tag on the little panel where you push the button for which floor you want. It might say Otis Elevators, and that goes back to this period as well in the 1880s and 1890s. This is the Chrysler Building in New York City with the iconic head of the Falcon here on the edge. This is the Flatiron Building. That's actually a three-sided building, kind of at the corner here in New York City. Atlanta also has a Flatiron Building. It's kind of down near Georgia State, kind of down in that area as well. So the development of skyscrapers transforms the downtown areas. The settlement patterns, we've talked about this a little bit before, where immigrants tend to congregate and group themselves together in areas within big cities because of common language, common foodways, common culture. And so we see those different pockets in the settlement patterns in the cities. Even today, this is a map from 2013, and you can definitely still see different pockets of various immigrant groups. Violence starts to erupt in some of the downtown areas, even including Atlanta. Atlanta by this point is a thriving urban area. There is also a growing upper class in the Black community in downtown Atlanta. At the turn of the century, Atlanta was one of the richest cities for Black Americans. And if you went down to Auburn Avenue, you had thriving businesses. Alonzo Herndon, he was one of the well-known Black businessmen in Atlanta, has this beautiful mansion in downtown. And there was this growing divide between the elite and the lower classes of African Americans in downtown Atlanta. And in 1906, a race riot erupted, and this was largely due to a report that there were 3 or 4 white women who had been assaulted by Black men in the downtown area. There's really no evidence that that ever happened, but as the newspapers were publishing this report in downtown Atlanta, these white Atlantans got worked up into just this, frenzy, wanting to hold somebody accountable for these Black men supposedly assaulting their white women. And when it was all said and done, there were dozens of people who had been killed and hundreds who were injured, and it got international press. Look at the image in the bottom left. This is the front page of a French newspaper that's showing this race riot in downtown Atlanta. So we're in 1906. This is long beyond the pre-Civil War days. And you've still got this very violent streak and this further division between the races in downtown Atlanta. You can see the military officials have been called out. The National Guard's been called out to maintain order in downtown Atlanta. And this is down on Decatur Street, kind of, again, near Georgia State University, where this race riot would have taken place. There was a professor at Georgia State, his name was Cliff Kuhn, and he was an expert in Atlanta's history. And he used to offer a walking tour of the Atlanta race riot, and he would take you through all the various spots in downtown Atlanta where different events took place, because it spanned out over a couple of days, the conflict that erupted in downtown Atlanta. We've got also in cities, as we mentioned, the crowded conditions. And these were known as the tenement houses. And you would have multiple families all living in one small space. And there would be one shared bathroom for 5 or 6 families out behind the apartment building. So here you can see the mom and the dad and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kids all living in this one room. Here you've got a bunch of men. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 that we can see pictured in this one room. And the conditions were bad for sanitation. It bred disease, garbage, crime, all kinds of problems in these incredibly crowded tenement houses. One of the good positives that came out of the rise of these urban communities was affordable entertainment at the turn of the century. And you've got all kinds of new technology that's also, again, adding to what people are doing in their spare time. One is going to the vaudeville show. Vaudeville is almost like a variety show or a talent show. It kind of reminds me of America's Got Talent, that TV show where somebody might come in and juggle, somebody might come in and have dog tricks, someone's singing, someone's doing some sort of acrobatic act. You've got all that rolled into one show, and that's pretty much what the vaudeville shows were. Then you've also got the Nickelodeons, where you could go and watch a motion picture at the Nickelodeon, and it cost you a nickel to get in to see that. So these were different forms of entertainment, but probably the one that was most well loved, especially in New York City, was Coney Island, which was an amusement park that was affordable. So upper classes, lower classes, middle classes, all would enjoy going to Coney Island and seeing the rides and the entertainment and all of the activity that was going on at Coney Island. We've already talked about Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. There's Annie Oakley, who was the sharpshooter, who was part of the Wild West. And again, notice that they recreate these historical scenes. He's got the cattle ropers. He's got the Indians. There's the Sioux Indians that are part of this, with the teepees pitched out here in an urban area. Again, just drawing free publicity to the Wild West show. And there's Sitting Bull. And I mentioned this the other day, that here he is in his traditional native dress, but then he's wearing Levi's blue jeans, kind of all rolled into one, speaking to some of the assimilation that was going on at the time. Music is also going to be transformed. We've got the rise of ragtime music. Ragtime's going to have a really fast beat to it, and it emerges into blues. So we have ragtime and we have blues that will all be, again, late 1800s and the early 1900s. The main founder, I guess you could call it the founder of the ragtime sound was this man, Scott Joplin, and he was well known across the United States for his music that was very, very popular. It was fun, it was upbeat, and ragtime was definitely the sound that comes about a little bit before jazz. We're not going to associate jazz music until we get really into the 1920s. So this is kind of the precursor, with this really fast syncopation and beat that goes along with the ragtime music and then the blues, and then you roll it all together and you're going to end up with jazz. The newspapers and the press also become quite popular and competitors of one another. Especially in New York City, you've got two competing newspapers, one published by William Randolph Hearst and the other one by Joseph Pulitzer. And so these were newspapers that they were trying to sell in the same town. So what's going to make you decide which newspaper to buy? Well, whichever one has the most interesting headlines. And that's where they tried to outdo one another. This competition was just brutal between Hearst and Pulitzer. And they started to get really sensational headlines. Last year, the kids were talking about, oh, they're trying to use clickbait, trying to get you to click on something on the internet because what the headline is, but then when you click on it, the story really is not that big of a deal, but they make it seem like it because of the title of the story or the link that they're sharing with you. That's exactly what they're doing with yellow journalism. So this term yellow journalism is going to be referencing the really just kind of outlandish headlines that were part of this competition between Hearst and Pulitzer. And sometimes people started to question, the validity of the stories because they were somewhat outlandish. And I know you've heard the fable about the boy who cried wolf. And when we get into the Spanish-American War that breaks out in the 1890s, that's going to be kind of what goes on. Some of the atrocities that are happening in Cuba at the hands of the Spanish are reported in the newspapers, and people are thinking, oh, well, it's just more exaggeration like we typically will see in these newspapers by Hearst and Pulitzer. The reason they call it yellow journalism is because of the cartoon character that you see at the top. His name was the Yellow Kid, and he was just kind of this not very intelligent kid who just did all of these crazy things, and they had the color cartoon in the newspaper, and that was really attractive and interesting to people for the newspaper not just be black and white, that it actually had colored cartoons. on the page. And so the Yellow Kid was the first of those colorized cartoons, and that's why it becomes known as yellow journalism at the time. Other journalists who are going to play a key, very key role in the rise of this demand for some sort of government involvement to resolve some of the problems that society is suffering from would be the muckrakers. And the term, you definitely need to know this term muckraker. Every AP exam that I've ever looked at has questions, usually in multiple places. There's usually at least one multiple choice question about muckrakers. And then there's usually a question somewhere, either in short answer, DBQ or LEQ, related to this time period with the progressive era and the muckrakers. So the muckrakers are exposing the problems. They're bringing these underlying issues from the Gilded Age, right? So we've talked about the Gilded Age, or we will be talking about how the Gilded Age is, from the outside looking in, everything looks grand and wonderful in the United States. Think about if you're, just arriving in New York City and you see the skyscrapers and the, Times Square lit up at night, and you've got the Brooklyn Bridge, and you've got all of this, fancy, elaborate life in these big cities. What you don't immediately see is the tenement houses and the crowded conditions and the corruption in the government. None of that's immediately obvious. So we refer to this time period as the Gilded Age. Something that's gilded is gold plated. If I had, something that was solid gold and something that was gold plated of a similar shape, you wouldn't be able to tell which one was which, because from the outside, they look the same. So the muckrakers are the ones that are exposing, they're uncovering all of these problems, these underlying problems in the United States, and exposing it to the American public for them to put pressure on the government to do something about it. All right. So the term muckrake comes from a tool that's used in a barn that cleans hay. So a muckrake, you rake through the hay and it gets the manure out of the hay and cleans it. So here you've got this political cartoon. Here's Theodore Roosevelt. And as we will see in chapter 19, Theodore Roosevelt is really the president who kind of forges his way into federal policy to clean up the problems of the United States. So here he is, and he's got his muckrake, and notice it says investigation, and it says meat scandal. That's going to be one of those that we look at here in just a few minutes. And so the muckrake is stirring all of this in this scandal up, right? So from the top, you wouldn't have seen the meat scandal, but the rake, the investigation, is turning this up for everyone to see all of the smelly problems that are there. One magazine that was part of this muckraking tradition was the McClure's magazine. And notice this woman, Ida Tarbell. She's going to take on J.D. Rockefeller and all of his predatory pricing and all of his big business tactics and strategies that hurt consumers and hurt small businesses and forces them out of business. She's going to expose all of that through a series of essays that are written in McClure's magazine. Right, notice the title here, the story of Rockefeller, opening of the second part of the history of Standard Oil by Ida Tarbell. So she is a muckraker. This is an example of a muckraker who is exposing the business strategies that J.D. Rockefeller is using and explaining them and how they are unfair in the economy, and that people start demanding that something must be done. Okay, politically, there are also issues that need to be cleaned up, and it's the way that these large urban areas were governing themselves. So look at this cartoon. You've got the big city there. You've got, standing in the middle, this big man, and on his vest it says party boss. So the bosses of the political machines were kind of the head of the local political organizations. And what's he handing out to the people? It says special privilege. It says franchise, meaning that you're giving people business contracts, whether it's garbage collection or it's some sort of a special privilege to transport people on ferry boats across New York Harbor. And then here you've got immunity from arrest. So he's passing all of these things out to the citizens who are just grabbing it up. But what are those people able to do in return for him? They're voting for him. So some of this corruption is going to become exposed a little bit more clearly. So let's think about what the political machine is first and how it works. So that party boss is at the top, controls everything in the way that the city runs. Then within the city, you have ward bosses. And they're going to be responsible for certain sections of the city. I mean, let's just stick with New York, where you've got Brooklyn, you have Queens, you have Manhattan, you've got the various boroughs. So there's going to be a ward boss responsible for each one of those sections of New York City, and they report back to the boss. And under them, within each neighborhood, will be a precinct captain. So if we think about this in terms of, let's put it in the situation of a school, okay? So the party boss would be Dr. Ritchie. Then the ward bosses are going to be the assistant principals, because there's an assistant principal that's in charge, you know, of multiple departments. And then below that, you would have precinct captains, which might be like your department chairs. So in social studies, I'm the social studies department chair. So I report to Mr. Horton, who is the assistant principal over social studies. I think he's also over foreign language. And then he reports to Dr. Ritchie. So here's what goes on. Let's say that something happens with one of the teachers in the social studies department. Maybe somebody's mother dies, father dies, or maybe they've got, I don't know, something goes on in their family. Then as the precinct captain, I would alert the ward boss, you know, this is going on. And then they in turn would notify Dr. Ritchie. So that's kind of like the chain of command here. But here's what they're doing. The party boss is going to determine within these different neighborhoods, within the big cities, where can we make the biggest impact? And so the party boss might show up at a big tenement house right before Thanksgiving. And the party boss is going to have an entire, you know, truck full of turkeys for Thanksgiving and pass them out to all these families in the tenement house. They're going to remember that the next time they go and vote. You know, that's the guy who brought us this Thanksgiving meal. How much money does that really cost the party boss? Not a whole lot, but he gets all of these votes in return for that. And they're going to tell their family and friends, you know, you're not going to believe what he did. If there's a wedding, if there's a funeral, if there is a bar mitzvah, if there is something going on that's of importance in the community, word travels through this chain of command up to the party boss. And the party boss is either going to send a gift, a wedding present, possibly might attend the funeral for this person. So they have a presence within the community, but in return, they're getting votes for that. So they're giving to the community, but what they're getting back is votes. And a lot of the areas that they really concentrate on are the immigrant communities. So these are people who have significant needs, and the party bosses pay attention to that. So let's look at this cycle here. So the residents vote for candidates supported by the political machine. The machine controls everything about the city. Those government contracts, the city employs different groups of people to do different things. So if you are getting that government contract in return, you need to be making sure that people vote for that party boss. And when the party boss gives you that contract, guess what? You're going to give the party boss in return. Some of that money you're going to give back as a kickback, kind of under the table. Thanks so much for giving me that business contract. Well, is that corruption? Sure it is. So why doesn't anybody report it or expose it? Well, because they're all benefiting from it. So this system becomes more and more and more ingrained in the urban areas, and it becomes more and more corrupt. So the political machine controls the city politics. It's run by these party bosses. They hand out jobs, contracts, and favors, and in return, those people vote those people back into office. And it's one big continuous cycle. And it becomes very, very well entrenched. One of the main ones here at the turn of the century is George Washington Plunkett. And the Tammany Society is the party that is controlling New York state politics. And Tammany Hall, we're going to go all the way back to the late 1870s when this first began in New York City with Boss Tweed. We'll talk about him in just a second. But where it becomes a difference, actually, let's start with Boss Tweed. Let me start here with Boss Tweed. So he's going to be one of the first really big party bosses in New York City. And he's this really large man, and he amasses a fortune. I mean, he literally has millions of dollars that are his. Well, where did he get all that money? Well, he gets it from the kickbacks from the government contracts that he's giving out to other people within the city, and they're paying it back to him. Everybody knows it's going on. He has, he's bribed other government officials. They're never going to hold him accountable. At one point, they try to arrest him, and there's a political cartoon. Notice these are Thomas Nast cartoons. Thomas Nast takes on Boss Tweed, but Boss Tweed gets arrested, and this Thomas Nast cartoon shows Boss Tweed's face coming out of the police building and his feet hanging out the windows. And he's like, I'm even too big for the police. The police can't even control me because I've bribed them as well. So you can always identify a Boss Tweed cartoon with Thomas Nast because of this big brooch that he has. He had this big diamond brooch that he used to wear, and he was larger than life. So Boss Tweed, his corruption is a constant focus of Thomas Nast cartoons. And Boss Tweed can't do anything about it because Thomas Nast, he's already the most famous political cartoonist in America. So if something happens to Thomas Nast, everybody's going to know that it's Boss Tweed that did it. So he single-handedly exposes the corruption of Boss Tweed and brings down his empire. And it's largely due to these political cartoons that were exposing the problems. So could you call that muckraking? Of course. So these cartoons of Thomas Nast are stirring up and exposing the corruption at the hands of Boss Tweed. All right, so Boss Tweed is out. The new party boss is this man, George Washington Plunkett. And George Washington Plunkett distinguished what he called good graft or honest graft and corruption. He's saying that if we are, he's saying, sure, I'm a party boss. I'm giving out government contracts, but I'm helping these people. I'm giving them jobs. I'm giving them work. And as long as we're not pocketing the money ourselves, so be it, right? So he's got a distinction here between the corruption of Boss Tweed and what he's doing with Tammany Hall and Tammany Society. So anytime you see mention of Tammany, that's talking about the political machine, the organization with the party boss at the top and all of these other networks of people connected to the party boss. That's the Tammany Society, and they would have their meetings where the ward bosses and the precinct captains would all work together here in the Tammany Hall. That was the organization of Tammany Society. All right, so here's another one of the Thomas Nast cartoons where it's got the Tammany ring down here at the bottom, and it says, who's to blame? If we were to look at the caption at the bottom, it's like, who's to blame? Well, they're all pointing at the other person. So you've got the chairs, the plasterer, the carpets, the carpenter, the key maker, the awning, right? The furniture, all of these people are all being blamed for the corruption in the city, and they keep pointing all the way back, and it comes back to Boss Tweed. Okay, so now that we've got all this corruption set up, and again, we're calling this the Gilded Age because you don't really see all of this underlying problem that's got to be resolved. Eventually, progressive reform will make that happen. So you're going to see Jack and the Wall of Giants. And so these are going to be the progressive reforms that are going to start to bring down J.P. Morgan and the other big major, Jay Gould, and some of these other people who are huge business tycoons in the cities. This cartoon or this painting is one of the main ones that represents what's going to be going on with progressive reform. Notice the title, rescued. Well, rescued from what? Let's look at what's going on down here. So we've got people spilling out of the saloon and violence. So this would go back to those temperance efforts. Here's a saloon that's already been shut down. You've got smoke and smog from the factories. So that tells us that we've got pollution, we have sanitation problems, we've got overcrowding in these urban areas, we have child labor that's going on, we have unsafe workplaces. And so here we've got this angel type figure that is rescuing this child from all of this corruption. This is what we mean by progressive reform. We're going to come in, we're going to clean up all of these underlying problems that have been festering for decades. There's two different efforts here, the progressives and the populists. And the populists are also wanting reform, but it's a different group of people. So progressive reform is where we're going to see the working class people trying to put restrictions on big business. Okay, trying to clean it up. The populists are going to be more of a movement of the farmers and the poor people in rural areas trying to help their economic situation as well. So they've kind of got the same goal here, which is reform, but it's different groups of people involved. Progressive reform is going to be more middle class, more upper class reform, where the populists are much more grassroots, lower class farming labor efforts at reform. Okay, we'll get into that a little bit more closely in class. This is nothing new. The idea of reform and having a government that's responsive to the needs of the people, that is a tradition in the United States. So if we were talking about continuity and change over time, this would be a continuity, the idea of calling for government reform to protect the interests of common citizens. That's what Thomas Jefferson wanted. Remember, didn't he form the Democratic Republican Party for the interest of the common man? Think about Andrew Jackson. Didn't he form the Democratic Party when he believed that the Whigs were only catering to the needs of the wealthy? So these populist reforms in the 1890s among the farmers are nothing new. That's something that's always been done. And then the progressive reforms in the early 1900s that are going to force through legislation that protect the interest of the laborers, the workers, and restrict the big businesses. This is continuing that tradition. So continuity and change over time. This is certainly a tradition of reform in the United States. All right, here is once again the Muckrakers. You've got TR or Teddy Roosevelt that is in the White House, and he is looking at all of the corruption here with his muckrake, right? So the muckrake and some of the muck, and it's this popular movement, and you've got all of these people that are caught up in it. Okay, a couple of the muckrakers that you need to be familiar with. We've already talked about Ida Tarbell and her efforts in bringing down J.D. Rockefeller. We've already talked about McClure's magazine. They featured some of Ida Tarbell's work. They also had the work of this man named Lincoln Steffens, and he's going to also expose problems with big business. Another muckraker who you certainly need to be familiar with is Jacob Riis. So it's R-I-I-S, but it's pronounced Reese. And his book is called How the Other Half Lives. I would know the title of this book as well. Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives. So what does that tell us about the intended audience? Just from looking at the cover of this book, you're looking at these kids who they don't even have any shoes on. They look pretty disheveled. They're not in school. So this is probably the lower class. So when we're saying that the title of this book is How the Other Half Lives, the audience would be the wealthy being shown how the other half, the poor, are living. And he does it through photographs. He doesn't do it through essays or books or magazine articles. He does it with photography. You've heard that before. A picture's worth 1,000 words. All you've got to do is look at this series of pictures and know that something needs to be done. Many of these upper class people, they've never been in a tenement house. They've never been in these highly concentrated urban parts of the city, the poor parts of the city. They've never been there. They don't know what the conditions are like. Well, Jacob Riis is going to bring those conditions to the people who have the power to make the changes. These are some of the images that come out of his book, How the Other Half Lives. We've already looked at this picture of the crowded conditions in the tenement houses. Look at this alley. So you've got men with clubs, you've got people hanging out of the windows, you've got the laundry hanging on cords between the windows outside. Looks dangerous down there. You've got these kids playing baseball in an alley. You've got this guy who's homeless living on some barrels in an alley. Look at the broken down condition of the housing. Look at these kids who are here in this squalor in this family. So these are the images that Jacob Riis brings to people of power in his book, How the Other Half Lives. So as a response to this, one of the efforts is going to be the City Beautiful movement. So we can look at the sanitation issues. I mean, garbage collection, when did that become a thing? Well, it becomes a thing here among the City Beautiful movement. So here are garbage collectors, because at the time, people just threw their trash out in the streets and it would build up. There was such a problem with sanitation in New York City that before the City Beautiful movement, the leaders of New York City realized they have a problem. What are we going to do with all this garbage that just keeps piling up in the streets? There's a dead horse. Do you see the horse here on this side in the street? And the kids playing nearby, like no big deal. So when these conditions continue to get worse, one of the solutions that the government officials in New York City came up with was to turn wild pigs loose in downtown New York to eat the garbage. So you had these pigs roaming around all over New York City, eating the garbage. And it, something's got to change. So the City Beautiful movement was launched to try to address those needs. And you can see these people here shoveling up the garbage out of the streets and taking it away. Now they're being paid, and who are they being paid by? They're being paid by the city government. And a lot of people would be looking for work and they'd say, we'll get rid of all this garbage. So to determine who's going to get that contract for that garbage collection, then that's going to be part of that connection there again with the political machine. All right, another big problem that is going to develop in the cities is the immigrant population, and they're struggling. They're being taken advantage of. They usually don't speak English. Wages are low. They're having a hard time supporting their families. And one of the solutions here is created by a woman named Jane Addams. Notice her name has 2 D's, Jane Addams. And she creates what are known as settlement houses. And the settlement house movement is a way for new immigrants to cities. Now, she lived in Chicago, and she creates this approach in downtown Chicago where she's going to provide temporary housing for new immigrants. And she's also going to provide childcare, free childcare for immigrant children. While the parents are getting on their feet, she's going to have, like job training and assistance to try to get these new immigrants the ability to support themselves and their families. So Jane Addams' settlement house, the one that she built in Chicago, is called Hull House. So Hull House is a settlement house. Other big cities start to follow this pattern that she starts in Chicago and creates their own settlement houses. But the one that's in Chicago that is the largest and most successful is hers, and it's called Hull House. So here is Jane Addams there on the right. And the building on the top is the first building, the Hull House, the original building of Hull House. Now it expands and ends up taking over an entire city block. So you've got apartment buildings, you've got community centers, you've got the childcare facility, you've got all this in one big complex that Jane Addams is running. Well, where does she get the money to do this? Well, she is going to lobby with some of the business owners, and she gets charity money donated to help to support the Hull House. All right. So while these kids are at Hull House, guess what Jane Addams is doing with them? She is teaching them English. Are they going to be learning English at home? Probably not. So a couple of things are solved here. You've got the ability for both parents in the family to go and get a job. You've got these young children who are learning to read and speak English. That's going to make them better able to assimilate into American society and become more successful later on. And if the children are learning English, they're probably teaching their parents a little bit as well. All right, so the key here for Jane Addams was to involve children at the core of her operation. So look at this advertisement, the opening of the Hull House Playground. And on Saturday, day when most of the workers wouldn't have been working, they're going to have a brass band. They're going to have kindergarten games. They're going to have a maypole dance, which is like this honoring of the coming of spring, and all kinds of races. It's going to be so much fun. So of course, all the kids want to go to the Hull House Playground. It's sort of like when you were a little kid, how many of you ever just begged your parents to take you to the Chick-fil-A play place or the McDonald's play place? Okay, your parents didn't want to go there. They took you there because you wanted to go there. Or Chuck E. Cheese, right? Nobody goes to Chuck E. Cheese. You're an adult because you like the pizza. You're going there because your kids want to go there. So if you make the Settlement House or Hull House a fun place for the kids, she's got art classes, she teaches music lessons and all of this. It's a great place for kids to go. Well, then the parents start to come as well. So she starts offering adult classes in English, starts offering, social events for the adults. So as they're all involved in this community effort, it's a positive experience for the city of Chicago, and it works out beautifully. So here is the Hull House today. The University of Chicago has really just grown up around Hull House. So it's right in the middle of the University of Chicago's campus, right? So here I am. I found the Hull House. I wanted to go in and wanted to go see. There's only one building left that you can go in and see, and it's a museum. And so there I am. I'm terribly excited to go in. And here's this guy on campus walking to class. He's probably like, what in the world? Who is Jane Addams? Why is this a big deal? Probably never even noticed the sign walking to class. So when you go into the museum, they've got artifacts and things. This is a replica model. This entire complex was all considered part of the Hull House that Jane Addams organized. And she also won the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts. So again, this is internationally known. And then this was a little creepy. Up here, this is her funeral mask. And that was a thing back in the 19th century when people who were of importance passed away. They would make a plaster mask of their face and of their hands. And, you would keep that as, I guess, a remembrance of this important person. So they have her funeral mask of her face and her hands there displayed. I thought that was a little creepy, but that's what they did in the 19th century. Okay, these are some pictures that they had on display. So what's more American than a barbecue and a beer? And so these men are sitting around and they're all in, good, wholesome social activity here at the Hull House. And it's all sponsored by Jane Addams. Look at these sweet little girls. They're at their music lessons. They're happy. They're enjoying what they're doing. They're learning English, and they're going to have an opportunity in their future to potentially go beyond what their parents have been forced to do, which is to work in factories for low wages and that kind of thing. So it's trying to get these young children on better footing as they're moving here. All right, one of the other really big efforts of muckraking is a book by Upton Sinclair called The Jungle. And Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, stirs up an entire industry and government action. All right, so in this book, The Jungle, and we're going to read an excerpt of it in class, but Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, is really about an immigrant family that moves to Chicago. That's the point of the book, is to tell the story of this immigrant family. But when people began to read the book, they get so caught up in where the family is working that they lose sight of the rest of the story. All right, so the family in the story of The Jungle, they work in a meat processing facility where the cattle are slaughtered, and then the carcasses and the meat, it's processed, and packaged to be sold in grocery stores. And it is disgusting. It talks about the lack of sanitation, that rats were running around and they were getting mixed in with the meat as it was being ground up. And it's just awful and disgusting. And so people were reading that and they're like, oh my gosh, is the meat that I'm buying at the grocery store, is this really how it's made? One of the persons who read this book was Theodore Roosevelt, and he was outraged. And he at the time was president of the United States. And he ordered an investigation of the meat packing industry to determine, is this really true, or has it been exaggerated in Upton Sinclair's book? Well, it turns out that the process was actually worse than what was depicted in Upton Sinclair's novel. And so as that was shown in the research that was done by the government, Theodore Roosevelt and other lawmakers were demanding that there be some sort of regulation. So as a direct result of Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, we get the law, the Pure Food and Drug Act, that requires certain standards be maintained in every facility that is producing food for human consumption. So for example, when you go to the grocery store now and you buy a package of meat, it's going to say at the top, grade A beef, meaning that this is coming from a facility that is inspected on a regular basis by government officials, maintaining these certain standards of cleanliness and sanitation. So you can be sure that your food that you're buying at this grocery store is safe, that it has been packaged in a facility that is meeting the standards and the regulations that are being overseen by the government. Same thing, so that's the pure food and pure food part of this. The Drug Act part of it is truth in advertising, because people were starting to try to make money by selling these magic elixirs that cure all of your medical problems. Well, really what those elixirs were, it was just alcohol, so that you forgot about what was bothering you. So the drug acts were making sure that if you had claims of medicinal help or claims of medicinal purposes for whatever it was that you were selling, you had to have research to back that up. The organization that will enforce this is the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, which does still exist today. So we've paired these two together, and you definitely need to pair them together in your notes, because this would be a cause and effect. What was the cause of the Pure Food and Drug Act to be created and passed through the legislature? Well, it's Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. That is a large, large portion of why this law came about. So could this be considered muckraking, where you've got a piece of literature or writing that exposes a problem in society that will then be dealt with by progressive reform? Yes. So this is the progressive reform. This is the muckraking piece of literature that brought about the reform effort. Okay, another area of reform is going to be safety in the workplace, and the event that prompts legislation to put in safety standards is a fire that takes place in the Triangle Factory in New York City. So the Triangle Factory was up on like the 8th or the 10th floor of this building. Here it is. And it was a shirtwaist factory. And a shirtwaist is kind of a 19th century term for vest, a men's vest that they would wear in a suit. And these women were at sewing machines, just rows and rows and rows, hundreds of sewing machines in this one big gigantic factory room. And so they were sewing the cloth together to make these shirtwaists or these vests at the Triangle Factory. Well, the business owners of the Triangle Factory were frustrated, and they wanted to make sure that their workers were as efficient as possible. Remember, we talked about scientific management, making sure that they're working as fast as they possibly can. And they were frustrated and worried that the women were taking too many breaks and not being focused on their work. So when the women were in the factory room, they padlocked a chain around the door handles to the factory room. Well, of course, with this being a textile factory, there's a lot of lint and dust around, and there was a spark from one of the machines that ignited a fire. in the factory room, and instantly the entire floor goes up in flames, but nobody could get out because remember, they've padlocked a chain around the door. Nobody knows that there's a fire on like the 7th or the 8th floor. The women are stuck there. They can't get out and they're trapped, and there's no fire extinguisher. There's no fire escape to get out of the upper store of the building. That was not a thing at that point. There wasn't any sort of requirement that any of that be in place. So there were over 150 women who died in the Triangle Factory fire, and the fire department was on the ground, powerless to do anything about it because their fire hoses didn't reach up that high in the building. Many of the women, their only option was to jump out the windows. So you see the bodies here of those who jumped out. And it was just a terrible, horrific scene here in New York City. As a result of this tragedy, there were demands for workplace safety regulation. So again, this is progressive reform. What was the Gilded Age problem? Unsafe workplaces. No minimum standards for safety exits and fire escapes and the structure of the building. So all of this is now mandated. Every month we have to have a fire drill at Lassiter High School and every school in Georgia by law once a month. You have to have fire extinguishers. You have to have smoke or exit signs that light up in case of a fire so people can get to the exits. All of that comes about because of the Triangle Factory fire. There's also a new provision for workers' compensation. If you are injured on the job because your employer is negligent in some way, you are entitled to workers' compensation for your injury. So all of that, again, came about as a result of the Triangle Factory fire. All right, so here's showing the arrangement here. So all of these are sewing machines in the factory room, and they're all just locked in here, and there's no way for them to get out. So the fabric and the scraps, it just instantly ignited all of the fire even faster. Okay, so there we have it. So in chapter 19, we will be looking at more of the progressive reforms that come about. We're going to make a chart that kind of puts it all into categories. What would be the causes? What was the Gilded Age problem that led to this particular progressive reform? So until next time, keep reading and go make history.